Take your protein pills. The Poisoned Electrick Head story. Brian Carney. Chapter 7. Highway to Hull. Once word of our performances began to circulate, the gigs came in thick and fast, aided, of course, by that staple of all fledgling bands, the manager stroke friend. When most kids were stood in front of a mirror with a tennis racket, miming to T-Rex records, Doug was sat in front of the mirror with a biro between his teeth, impersonating Peter Grant and Alan Klein. Who put the piss in impresario? The nerd in entrepreneur? Douglas William Batley Esquire, at your service. He was a lad slight of frame, weighing maybe 70 pounds when soaking wet, and carrying an anvil, and he wasn't very tall, but boy was he wide. I first clapped eyes on him when he passed me in the subway one day, his luxurious hair blowing in the breeze. He looked like a piece of tumbleweed that had blown into town, which was pretty much the case. He came from near Warrington, Billy's old stamping ground, so he'd had dealings with the aristocrats, and later Moon, managing to book them a gig on it, or as good as, in far-flung Louth. So this was his foot in the door with Poisoned Electric Head. Billy had asked him to manage us once before, but he'd refused on the ground that there were too many of us, and we would need 2 PA systems. This barometer of his music industry savvy was followed by the line, "I want this band to fail." His wisdom behind this being that our resultant dented confidence would make us that much easier to manage when we form the next one. One thing Doug did excel in, though, was limpet-like persistence. Guys bigger and meaner avoided coming to blows with him because they didn't want to do time for murder. And with Doug, if you didn't kill him, then 20 years down the line, he'd emerge through your cat flap and slaughter your firstborn. Thus, despite his dodgy credentials and some misgivings from some band members, he was hired and instantly set about raising our profile. A little aside at this juncture. Of all the things I've written in this book, this is one I regret. My depiction and treatment of Doug, it was out of order. There's nothing I can do about it now. He wasn't a bad guy at all. I was the bad guy. Anyway, back to the story. To be fair to the guy, as he wasn't from St. Helens, he had his sights set a bit further afield and realised that there was life out there beyond the town boundaries. It could be a little like the film Pleasantville, where the geography lesson only extends to the end of the high street. Thus Doug set about badgering venues far and wide. Anyone cocky enough to advertise in the NME, or foolhardy enough to possess an entertainment licence was fair game. And appropriately enough, our first out-of-town booking was in Hull. Why? Well, Hull and St. Helens had established a kind of special relationship, the results of which can still be seen today, so it was the obvious choice. Promoters in both towns had seen the wisdom of importing groups from other hard-bitten parts of the country, and one St. Helens band, the Tractors, had embraced the travel bug and forged links with the likes of the House Martins and the Levellers 5. We'd never got further than Liverpool with Academy of Unrest, and back then the thrill of sitting in the back of a transit van was something special, perched in the semi-darkness, using speakers as chairs, everybody cracking cans and laughing, the anticipation running through your veins like an expensive drug. With Hull it was no different, except the van was bigger, the journey longer, and we had a few guest passengers along for the ride. One of them was George. Let me tell you about George. He was an old-school psychedelic lighting man who'd somehow been frozen in time since the days of Pink Floyd at the UFO Club. The only explanation for this was his hermit existence as sole carer for his elderly parents in a Victorian cottage on the edges of town, where he lovingly preserved the dying art of 60s hot oil jiggery-pokery. His nights were spent projecting day-glow amoeba shapes onto the neighbour's garage wall whilst listening to Tonto's expanding headband. I forget who put us onto him, but when we first called round, it was like stumbling upon Syd Barrett. His parents were charming, framed by a clutter of old-world ephemera, as they shouted the absent-minded professor of a son downstairs, and he appeared, all Oxbridge politeness and dishevelled acid casualty crazy diamond. If he was surprised that psychedelia had returned and come looking for him, he didn't register it. Maybe in his mind it was inevitable. He'd prepared a demonstration of a dazzling array of homemade contraptions, explaining that parts were hard to find these days, so one must improvise. You could almost hear Tony Hart's camp tones announcing, "Now, let's go and see what George has built for us today," to the sound of bubbling beakers and boinging springs. Everything was held together with brown masking tape, including his glasses. He told us that the strobes he used had been liberated from medical establishments and could therefore operate outside the legal safety parameters imposed on commercial models. Though what he omitted to mention was that he was an epileptic who habitually inhaled the chemicals in his equipment trunk to get high. Still, we didn't expect to find anyone normal, as we were like one enormous oddball magnet. Also, along that day, to corroborate my last point, were Doug Batley and a friend of some of the band, who it's best to refer to as Mr. X. He turned up with half a dozen crates of Continental pills, which he was knocking out at next to nothing. They wouldn't be the only things he would be knocking out that day. So, needless to say, everybody bought one, and from the off, there were little bottles being quaffed in all directions. By the time we got to Hull that afternoon, we were all fairly lashed, but everything went smoothly with the venue and the sound check, so we were confident and excited about the show. We wandered off in little groups around Hull, looking for something to eat and more beer. And come the time to return, the venue was packed. But as performance time drew near, we realised that Bill hadn't returned. He'd made an appearance earlier after a brief foray into town, when Mr. X was proudly brandishing a policeman's truncheon he'd purloined from an antique shop. Its discreet pocket size and swingability bringing an evil glint to his eye. But that had been hours ago. Now the pair of them, and Doug, were nowhere to be seen, and it was almost curtain up, and the promoter was getting twitchy. In the end, he gave us 10 minutes to get on stage or clear off, and unexpectedly during this debate, the phone on the wall rang. Billy instinctively answered it, nodded a little, then hung up. His face barely registered the slightest emotion during the call, but that was Billy all over. He wasn't one for dropping jaws and raised eyebrows. Still, you could sense it wasn't good news. "That was Bill," he announced in deadpan fashion, leaving the rest of us to speculate what the punchline would be when he saw fit to deliver it. "They've been arrested for GBH." Resigned glances passed between Billy and the promoter, and we had little recourse other than to push our way through the crowded auditorium and dismantle the gear in stunned silence. A little later, me and Phil sat dejected at the bar nursing a beer each, as one of the house martins tried to console us. History has well documented their respective evolutions into superstar DJ, pop maverick, and children's author. But our companion that night was the one who graduated to assault with a deadly weapon, the poetic irony of which is not lost on me to this day. He said that these things happen. Well, he would know, wouldn't he? And we tried to put a brave face on it, but inside we were seething. The remainder of the evening was spent in the car park of Hull Police Station, where, at 5 a.m, the metallic shutter rattled open, and in they climbed. Bill's opening gambit was to rotate a pointed warning finger to everyone, and strongly advise that nobody say a word, a tactic they'd obviously discussed upon release. So we trundled back to St. Helens in silence, the only sound being George's gentle inhalations on the ether bottle. The story eventually emerged, which involved an antique truncheon and someone's teeth making a hasty departure. Roughly speaking, it wasn't a great start to our touring career, so we decided to permanently cross Hull off our list of future engagements, in case anyone ever made the connection between PEH and GBH, and for want of someone to blame, because it wasn't those three, was it? We blamed the drink. At our next out-of-town appearance, a strict no-booze policy was enforced, which resulted in an inordinate amount of burping and a stilted, phoned-in performance. The following night, we were back on the sauce again. So be it. Hull would prove to be a taste of things to come. A warning unheeded, perhaps. Ours was not a surefire equation. The composite elements didn't always produce the desired results. But it was worth the risk for the nights when they did. Just. Chapter 8, Artwork. With 3 ex-art students in the band, the artwork was never going to be something farmed out to a third party. And in Phil, we had something extraordinary, so there was never any question of him not taking charge of it. In the early days, though, there was that much enthusiasm for things that me, Phil, and even Webb were knocking designs out constantly. They all had some kind of electric head thing going on, and all contained a dead fly and a bottle of Thunderbird somewhere. The poster for that first Alfred gig was one of mine, and had a mad doctor mixing chemicals into a head from bottles marked Moon and Subversion, etc. But the one I'm proudest of was based on the kids' TV show The Trapdoor, which had Burke, the plasticine dungeon keeper, pointing at the trapdoor as the band members emerged from it. My posters were cartoony and jokey, but once Phil got his teeth into designing them, things moved into a darker, more graphic arena, and a series of electric heads, each more detailed and grotesque than the last, started to emerge. They were the opposite of traditional posters and flyers, in that they were often hard to read. The facts didn't exactly jump out at you. Even the band's name wasn't always immediately apparent. These are things you glance at as you go past on the bus. You're not supposed to stand and study them. Plus, why go to all that effort to advertise an appearance at a small-town alehouse? Well, none of that mattered, because cramming it all in was what we did best. And if you took the time to look, it was all in there. You could find scarab beetles, pipes and bongs, mushrooms and moons, eyes in pyramids and tubes in skulls, faces within faces and bubbles aplenty. A sprawling, organic, mechanical, alchemical microcosm. We soon had a small collection, and as we toured farther afield, we reused them, giving them abbreviated names like Tongue and Vessel, and the ambitious and impressive Hourglass. Picture a huge egg timer sitting in a bowl, flanked by bubbling tubes and pipes. A solitary eye stirs from it, but the hourglass is also an arrow pointing upwards, the tip of which is simultaneously a pyramid that sits between the 2 outstretched hands from Michelangelo's The Creation of Adam. The bowl rests on a compressed, grimacing head, but where the squinting eyes meet the nose, there's a smaller head, hitting itself with a truncheon, a clear reference to Hull, and beneath it yet another face, a satyr, racked in pain, the inflamed nostrils of the large head doubling as its horns. The whole hourglass image is mounted in a cracked marble frame, decorated with Om symbols that each depict a different phase of the moon. In each corner of the frame is a small circle displaying a minuscule cryptic scene, an oblique reference to a song lyric. Webb drew the frame using a rapidograph pen and painstakingly built up the shades and cracks in the marble with a pointillist dot technique. It took him 2 months. Phil used a similar technique for the main image, and it's fair to say he didn't dash it off in a couple of nights either. For the pair of them, this task had a deep, meditative quality, a reverent labour of love, aided by the illuminating sacrament of weed, which they chain-smoked throughout. And this was all for a tiny pub gig. Creative endeavour was its own reward. The promotional functionality of the piece was almost an afterthought. That's the atmosphere the Dead Fly exuded in 1986. When someone suggested that Phil purposely design a poster to sell at gigs, he'd by then become so heavily immersed in airbrush technique and the biomechanical artwork of H.R. Geiger that he created the definitive electric head, part skull, part helmet. It was an image that would become synonymous with us as a group. In fact, as instantly recognisable as those 2 black circles over a slightly bigger one are for the Disney Corporation. Chapter 9. Telebot. One Friday, an away team had been sent to Wigan to fly post for an upcoming gig. I myself couldn't join them as dead fly commitments were keeping me in the warmth and comfort of my office, far from wallpaper splashes and slapdash workmanship. One eye's always peeled for the local constabulary or occasional irate citizen, while the other's doing a poor job of overseeing the ectoplasm and snot application, most of which ends up on those roped into this sordid, furtive little activity. I was doubtless being serenaded by the unholy row, rehearsing in the adjacent room, a space we actively discouraged people from using, but which was fiercely popular due to its superior acoustics. The Unholy Row embraced that punk ethic of incompetence as a virtue, and in their case, that other adage, practice makes perfect, held no fear, as with each rehearsal, they seemed to actively get worse. They were our best customers. The little room was also much beloved by another trio, Maisie Fade. 3 placid and pleasant guys who produced a tortured and angst-ridden torrent of noise, best listened to from a distance further than the other side of the wall. We hit it off immediately on a personal level, but I found it infinitely more difficult to warm to their music, putting me in a delicate position whenever they sought my opinion on it. Finally, after much fielding and dodging the subject, I found something positive to say about them, and told them hand on heart that of all the bands frequenting the place, they were the only one I could envisage landing a Peel session. Having been raised on John Peel's gritty oral assaults, it was as sincere a compliment as I could muster, and observing their pleased reaction, I felt I'd spread a little happiness and bought myself some breathing space. Bolstered by my comments, they promptly sent their demo to him to no doubt disappear in a sea of C30 cassettes. John Peel received hundreds a day, and faced with such a responsibility, did the only thing possible, listening to a handful in the car on the way home after the show. That Maisie Fade's demo fell into this hallowed pile is amazing enough, but that it blew him away and prompted him to telephone them in person borders on the incredulous. 3 Peel sessions followed, culminating in the on-air announcement, "I want my daughter to marry one of Maisie Fade." Well, it taught me a valuable lesson, though it seems your casual comments wither and die seconds after their utterance. It's not always the case. A delicate flap of a butterfly's wing may just have caused that earthquake after all. So keep a tight rein on your negative thoughts and only release the positive ones. That way, you've more chance of loving any illegitimate conceptual children you may have unwittingly sired. Maisie Fade are no more, but I'm still friends with all 3 of them, and hand on heart, I hope I always will be. The dead fly blessed me with the best of lifelong acquaintances. One Friday, after being press-ganged into drinking Thunderbird all afternoon with AF, I staggered up to the Fly to let the Unholies in. They were one of the few bands who rehearsed on a Friday night. I think it was part of their social calendar, but they were low maintenance once up and running. My session with AF had taken its toll, and before long I passed out on the office floor. At the end of the night they found me flat out, so I was awoken by them, and they carried me to the storeroom so they could put their gear away, totally unfazed by my inability to walk there myself. I declined their offer to drive me back to the pub, so they took me home and almost certainly carried me up the stairs to my flat. If the atmosphere of the dead fly needs to be summed up in any way, then that little story doesn't do a bad job of it. When the others returned from their postering jaunt, they were carrying a tailor's dummy. They'd come across someone chucking it out and took it off his hands, though what role it was going to play was unclear. A daft one, probably. It did indeed go on to join us on stage a few times before Phil took it home, muttering, "I might be able to do something with this." Several months passed, and before you could say psilocybe cubensis, magic mushroom season was upon us again, and an evening at Phil and P's place was arranged at the first opportunity. We'd reached that stage where we'd become a bit blasé with the mind-bending effects alone, and we're always trying to pull some strange stunt to complement them, and mess with each other's heads into the bargain. With this in mind, I spent the afternoon throwing a little song together in the studio that was heavy on the pitch shift vocals and sonic effects. It was a whimsical little number that had been dwelling in my head called Snobs. I was still smarting from being dumped by a Susanna Hoffs lookalike from the posh end of town, whose parents had put an end to the affair because they thought I was a dropout. And rather than viewing it as an occupational hazard directly related to the Charles Manson reflection that greeted me in the mirror each morning, I chose to tackle this social injustice by writing a song about it. It was either that or ritual suicide on her front lawn, which would have only sent shock tremors through Cut Above Close's neighbourhood watch scheme. I was pleased with the song's multi-layered pitched voices. They brought to mind the Andrews sisters. Well, it was more like one Andrews sister with 3 heads, but you get the picture. and it was sure to cause perplexed confusion when I unveiled it that evening. Snobs went on to become a bona fide song in our set list and was much loved for its Zappa-esque motifs at the end of each line. A crashing car, a snatch of Floyd's money, and various call and response shouts from P&AF. After the couplet, they live in a neighbourhood where everybody has a nice car, but they don't tell the neighbours that their relatives are living in par. Their retort was, "Who are you looking at? Was it him, Jim? You're spoiling me trip." The Jim thing referred to a classic dickhead routine, regularly deployed whenever two guys wanted to beat up an innocent bystander on his own. After trapping their intended victim, a surreal vaudeville sketch would ensue, whereby they would act out a scene concerning some past infraction against a relative, the perpetrator of which was, of course, the victim. There were subtle variations on the standard set piece, but the result was always the same. And despite any desperate pleas from the guy on the receiving end, an innocent verdict was never arrived at. This wasn't 12 angry men, you see, just two pissed ones who hadn't copped off and never did. When it happened to me once, the scene was played out with such dramatic flair that clearly someone was angling for Best Supporting Actor, and it was almost a relief when the ham acting ended and the headbutting began. When Northwest Arts used to frequently comment about a lack of culture in the town, they were obviously unaware of these spontaneous and imaginative outbursts of street theatre. Back to Phil's, though, and the thing about magic mushrooms is you can never quite gauge the dose, and this particular night, we'd hideously underestimated the potency. After warming up gently with Bern and Eno's My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, we graduated to the Butthole Surfer's Her Way to Stephen. Someone put Salvador Dali's Large Door on the TV with the sound down, which didn't help matters. When it was first screened in 1930, it caused a riot in which property was destroyed and people injured. An understandable reaction, the relentless onslaught of unconnected images, was akin to being mentally violated. I felt like what little shreds of sense that had managed to take root in my psyche were being systematically peeled away, like the stringy strands on a banana. And once they were gone, what would remain but a blank canvas? At art college, we were often told to whitewash old paintings and reuse the frames for something more vital. But I was loath to do the same with my life's accumulated experiences. I figured it was time to lighten the mood, so I slipped on my little creation, failing to realise that everyone else was far more wrecked than I was. It caused mass confusion. People jumped up cursing. Some left the room, and Phil and Al went to sit with the dog in the kitchen, as it was the one thing they knew was real. A little later, when normality had returned a little, but we were still far from normal, Phil got his own back. Flicking a switch on the wall, he told me to open the cupboard under the stairs and look inside. I tentatively grabbed the handle and was struck by a wheezing, whirring sound and a strange glow emanating from within. And what I saw next was somewhat hard to process. A pulsating red light sat in the middle of its forehead. Its eyes glowed green, and a bank of multicoloured lights flashed up and down its chest. Its arms were bedecked in circuits and glowing wires, and in the middle of its chest was a telephone dial. Where most people keep the vacuum cleaner, Phil had a robot. Just think about that. It was the old tailor's dummy now transformed into the telebot. The song of the same name had come about because of a synth noise resembling a phone dial sound, and this had led to the idea of a creature part man, part machine and part telephone. Except now it had come to life and was living under Phil's stairs. The noise it was making was due to the extractor fan inside it, enabling it to spew dry ice when attached to a smoke machine. Phil confessed he'd been building it for months, but had been waiting for the optimum moment to unveil it. I complimented him on his timing. Despite inevitable comparisons to Iron Maiden's Eddie or Spinal Tap's Stonehenge monument, we soon warmed to the idea of a mascot and couldn't understand why we'd not built one sooner and why more bands didn't do the same. Though it's hard to imagine today's current crop of acts following such a path. What could Coldplay lower on stage at the optimum moment? A huge dripping tap? Or the Hives? Nah, too obvious. The Strokes? I can imagine a big pulsating heart like you see in anatomical diagrams, all its ventricles and aorta on display in cutaway fashion. But no, it's never going to happen. Although it's nice to see that it's de rigueur now to have some sort of band uniform. Another one of our sins that we were regularly condemned for. Around this time, someone rolled up to practice with a tailor's dummy's head they'd found on a tip. It was hollow and made of a spongy kind of plastic material, and by cutting it up the back and putting some eye holes in, it was possible for AF to wear it, resulting in an extremely weird effect. Bunn remarked that this wearing of old junk was tatty and unprofessional, and pointing to Phil's Geiger-esque poster, said he'd be willing to wear one of those masks if we could acquire some. Never one to shirk a challenge, Phil said he'd get onto it, and this was the start of our evolution towards a more corporate look. As I've said, uniforms simply weren't done in the late 80s. People were still trying to forget the PVC jumpsuits of Gary Newman and Buggles a few years earlier, but we didn't care. The dead fly sat a few doors down from an industrial clothing supplier, the owner of which eyed us with suspicion and thinly veiled mocking derision, but not so much as to prohibit selling us half a dozen plastic suits. They were the white disposable type you often see in ITV forensic dramas starring Warren Clark, whose Clockwork Orange days are no doubt naught but a dim memory to him now. Phil customised them by painting a letter on each of them with his airbrush. When we stood in a line, they spelled poison. To complete the look, a friend dropped in one night with 2 surgeons' outfits. They had hoods and boots and looked like something from the Andromeda strain. They were perfect for P and Andy, and just for good measure, Phil knocked out a range of creepy latex masks. This new and flamboyant image fell together just at the right time, for we would soon be taking our first tentative steps into the exciting and dangerous world of video. To be continued.
Poisoned electric head, 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 poisoned electric, 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 poisoned electric head, poisoned electric head, poisoned poisoned electric.